how can you always be creating that space to be human, but also to be curious? Often I think we're so emotionally tied up in the change. We're passionate about it, we're committed, but in a way we're pushing so hard that we're almost swatting away what is really important information, that muscle of asking open and curious and, of course, catalytic questions. It's kind of life-changing.
Hey everyone, it's Hildy, and this is the Creating the Future podcast. I'm glad you've joined us here today. This is a place for us to explore what really creates social change. What will actually create the healthy, joyful future we all want to live in? I'm so happy that May Miller-Dawkins is joining us for the podcast today. For over 20 years, May has been working with community groups and social movements to support effective, long-term social change efforts. From large global efforts like Oxfam to locally led grassroots efforts, May's focus is on cultivating collective leadership, the power we have together that none of us has on our own. Given May's experience facilitating such a broad variety of catalytic discussions and cross-sector collaborations, it is my joy to welcome May Miller-Dawkins to the podcast today. Welcome, May, to the podcast. It is always a pleasure to be with you.
So exciting to be here, Hildy. Thanks so much.
Can you start out by just sharing a little bit with our listeners about what is it in your life? You are so passionate about social justice and always have been. What is it in your life that has led to that passion?
So I think it definitely is always has been of growing up very much in a family that was very involved in the community, very committed to social justice, and had that experience that I know many people in this field have had of growing up around those conversations over the dinner table or being out at community meetings or in protests as a young person. And I do see it as one of the great privileges of my life, and there are many, but that I just had that real sense of it being for all of us, to be in those spaces, to be connected to each other, to be involved. And so my parents were both very involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. My mum was very involved in the feminist movement in Australia and helped pioneer feminist public broadcasting on the ABC, which is the Australian equivalent of kind of PBS or NPR. And they remain in their 80s hugely engaged in community issues and in community matters. And I was also hugely influenced by my grandmother, who was also a very fierce advocate. She was a fierce advocate of Irish independence. She was a fierce supporter of Aboriginal self-determination and rights. And she did that through her activism, funding, and her collaboration. And I was also really lucky to grow up next to my aunt by marriage, who's an incredible woman, Dr. Kate George, first Aboriginal woman, a lawyer in Western Australia, continues as an elder in the movement, leading a lot of work on Aboriginal self-determination and clean energy now. And so growing up in amongst all of that was just very aware and very lucky to feel very connected to things and to have that real sense that you could make a difference, you could contribute. And also that particular privilege actually of learning from Aunt Kate and being connected to Aboriginal culture, because that's not the case for many young white Australians. And that was then just very strong for me throughout my life. Even we moved across the country, and even when I was in primary school, we were able to connect with a mentor about something we were interested in, and that was what I was interested in and got to learn more about. And at the time, the education on Indigenous history and culture was abysmal in Australia in the 80s, as I know it was in other parts of the world as well. And then I just started being involved in things. I remember organising protest sit-in at the school about the nuclear testing in Mururoa Atoll. I was in early high school, and then later on, my brother Tom Dawkins, who you know very well, who introduced us originally over a decade ago, he and I set up our first organisation when we were teenagers, which was really about young people in New South Wales, the state that we lived, where Sydney is in Australia, getting involved in and connected to political issues and community issues. And so that was an amazing process of just learning by doing. And I think even though I've had the opportunity and privilege of a lot of education over my life, nothing beats that early just learning by doing, being at the payphone in my high school corridor during my lunch times, calling various people to try to organise things, and actually building a real community of young people who really believed in being involved and having a voice. And I guess that flowed through into university, where I was again involved in issues around Aboriginal native title, but also treatment of refugees, which was a very big issue in Australia at the time. There were very terrible, regressive policies at the time. And then over time, I became involved through Oxfam in a international network that involved hundreds of young people under 25 being change makers in their own communities. And I ended up working in that program as one of my first jobs out of university. And so had this just remarkable education about all of the ways that people were influencing change in their own context, and then also how do you actually bring people together to learn and examine and grow, and how does that fuel their own efforts. So that was all of the things that I think shaped my early and then kind of early adult life and really set me on this path.
And it's a journey that you're continuing to walk, that learning journey.
All the time, all the time.
In all of that, you have been a student of social change, obviously, your entire life. When you see change happening, what do you see are the factors that undergird change? What leads to change?
So for me, there are some things that I keep seeing again and again. And I've had the opportunity to work at very different levels and also to support people who are doing this kind of work at different levels. So from very community-based and led change through to kind of big global initiatives. And I would say across it all, these are the things that really stand out to me. So I think one element that's really important is that people can come together and genuinely imagine a better way of future, and especially people who have a very direct stake in that change and in that future. And I think where we often get stuck is really when we, as your work illustrates so beautifully, when we get very stuck on the quote-unquote problem, or when we really lose sight of possibility. And I think a lot of people can resonate with that right now because there's so much that feels so heavy. But I think holding on, creating those spaces where you can imagine, you can see those bits of the future in the present because they're always there. There's always that work happening, always those glimmers of people creating that possibility in what's around us. And so using that as a real fuel for our imagination and for sustaining ourselves. I think one other thing that is so, so crucial is how we retain our curiosity about each other and about the systems that we're operating in, and really importantly about ourselves and how we are showing up. So I think when you lose curiosity about any of those things, it can be very hard to keep really moving forward. And there's a lot of pressure to actually lose curiosity because isn't that what it means to become an expert in a lot of spaces that you now know? But I think I see people retaining real curiosity and holding themselves back from immediate judgment, catching themselves and saying, wait a second, can I actually lean in? Can I actually ask a question and see what is actually happening here? And again, including with ourselves. So that's the really hard one, to catch yourself and be like, wait a second, what's going on in me right now that I'm reacting in this way?
It's challenging those assumptions. Because the assumptions is the opposite of the curiosity.
Absolutely. And being able to even know that they're there and name them is such a huge, huge step, and to surface them collectively. What are we holding as assumptions here?
It's just always so interesting to me, the thought of challenging our assumptions. Our assumptions are invisible. That's what makes them assumptions. So you're in that catch-22 of we need to challenge our assumptions, and I don't even know I have them. Yeah. And then we trip over them. Of course we do.
I actually love this method that was developed by Dr. Jess Dart, who's a leading Australian evaluator. It's called Most Significant Learning. And you know how if you get a group of people together and you say, what are we learning in this work? And then everybody kind of has these quite anodyne statements. Oh, we're learning that collaboration is really important, or we're learning that it's really hard when there isn't the funding, or whatever. And this process, which is really beautiful, says, think of an assumption that you were holding that turned out not to be true in the past year, in the past whatever. And you go and you pair off and you share that story with another person, and they write it down, and then they also take your story to a group and you take their story to a different group, and you have this kind of empathic exercise of relaying the story a bit as if it's your own, and the group discussing what's most significant that's emerging out of these stories, and even choosing one to share back with the bigger group. But I love that clarity of, it's in retrospect that you can see, oh, I had assumed that, but actually this. And it can be as much positive as negative. We might think that that's always, I had assumed this was in place, but it wasn't. But it can just as often be, I had assumed that nobody would turn up, but actually there was this real groundswell of interest, and this is what that's meant. I think so much, and I guess this relates to one of the other things that I see when that's a real condition for groups, networks, movements to really sustain change over time, is that they actually do create these relational and learning practices. So they can come together, they can make sense of things, they can care for each other, and they can be creative. And if you have and kind of can weave practices over time that make sense for you and for your developing movement, network, group, I think that can really sustain both the people and the work, because it does enable this real learning to emerge where people actually start doing things differently as a result.
Can you give an example of that? What does that look like in terms of those practices?
So I'll talk about a practice that's kind of within an initiative, and then a practice that's kind of across. So I've been really lucky to work with an initiative called Yuwaya Ngarra-li over the past 8 years, which is a partnership between the Dharriwaa Elders Group, which is a Aboriginal community-controlled group in a small community in Australia in a remote area, and they're in partnership with the University of New South Wales, which is one of the major leading universities in the country. And the university is committed to support the elder-led and community-led kind of visions for change over the long term. So that has meant that a lot of change has been needed on the university side, because universities are not actually well set up to support community-led efforts in a way that's genuinely community-led. And the partnership across the two organisations, I've been in the position of being a kind of learning partner with them, where we've had regular reflective practices where the whole group gets together across both and is able to look back and think about the highs and lows of what's happened and to really grapple with actually the different realities of being in frontline community work and being in a kind of support and advisory role in a university, and to also consider what is changing and what possibility is and what those in the community are hearing from community, and to really work together on kind of what the next steps are. But a lot of that is the power of doing that regularly over many years. So it's also meant that through many different kinds of changes and crises, through the pandemic, through floods, through the continual crisis of over-policing, through many things, through, changes in the organisation, there's a real robustness to how that group can show up together and kind of grapple with things that are emerging and work out what needs to shift, because they've got a real collective, they've really nurtured that ground together. They've really practiced.
It sounds like rituals and traditions and the kinds of things that become, this is how we do things.
I think that's right. And it's really that part of the leadership is in carving out the space for that, especially when other things feel really urgent. That's when you need the space the most. But of course, that's when we do it the least, and for really understandable reasons. But I think, yes, the rhythm, the ritual, the understanding that there is a space we can all go to, there is a space for what people need to bring up, and there is a way that we can all come there and practice the care and honesty that we've been practicing for each other for a long time. I've seen this group navigate so much and with such depth and care, and so many things that a lot of other groups would shy away from grappling with or might fall apart because they haven't. So I think those kinds of practices are really, really crucial. And then kind of across, one of the things that I love doing the most is helping leaders come together from across different systems, sectors, places. So I run these action learning sets where you'll meet monthly. So it's low commitment. There's no preparation, which is very important. I love Adrienne Maree Brown's presence over preparation. That's very much the vibe for these groups. And you come and you work with whatever's in the room. So everybody shares what they're currently tussling with. And then you choose one person's opportunity, question, issue, and the group asks them open and curious questions for a long time. And you can normally see a moment where something happens. It's often visible. And because they've been asked different kinds of questions and their brain has gone in different directions, and yet there's that moment that you know very well where something kind of lands and suddenly a pathway emerges, a different possibility emerges. And so I love that practice and I love holding that space. I see it really as crucial infrastructure for people who are leading complex and transformative change efforts, because we just need that space. It's fully confidential, so it's not Chatham House rules. What happens in that group stays in that group. But everybody takes out of it so much insight and empathy, and often people will bring something that's been really bothering them but also languishing because it's complex and maybe it's not something they could yet kind of take to their board, or it's not something they could necessarily talk to peers about in other spaces, and they get a real head of steam. So there's some clarity that comes out, and then you often see this amazing amount of creative action happening after somebody is in the seat. So that's another practice. It's quite ritualistic. So you've got your monthly appointment. It's always on the same slot, and we come and we go through the same motions together.
Everything that you're talking about, from that sense of possibility to that sense of curiosity to those ritual practices, what you're really talking about is space to be human with each other.
Yeah.
We don't really think about the answer to what does it take to change the world. We need space to be human with each other is not usually what we go to.
But isn't it everything, actually? And it's because we've got all of this untapped potential and creativity when we're often playing our roles in the system.
Yeah.
Because it's not necessarily, or it doesn't feel okay always, to bring that full vulnerability or creativity necessarily to the table when there's a lot of sometimes visible, sometimes invisible structures and expectations that are pushing us to have the answer, to hold it together. So these spaces are spaces where people can be honest that they don't know and can genuinely explore and at all of those different levels. So I feel like through the process of coming back to these groups again and again, what I often hear from people is that the approach to asking different kinds of open and curious questions, including catalytic, I always introduce a bit of that as well. You have to listen differently and listen for what's there and what's not there. And there's a huge amount of care from people that goes into how they listen, the questions they ask, and then the reflections they give back to the person. But I hear that what's often transformative for people is that process of listening and questioning, they take out into different spaces. So I often have people coming back saying, I'm using this with my staff and it's completely changing our conversations. I have a couple of groups that I run annually for different foundations where it's a group of the social entrepreneurs that they support. And what's really interesting in those groups is that you can see how primed people are to jump to solution at the start because that's their daily reality. They're often in early stage or maybe growth stage social enterprises. So their day is just solving problems, being decisive. They can be quite also committed to this identity of I have a bias towards action. And so it can be quite uncomfortable to be pulled out of that. Some of them can find it excruciating, actually, to spend close to an hour asking someone open questions and almost impossible. You might find that people come in and they are technically asking questions, but not really asking questions. So have you thought about doing X?
Right. Advice we could talk about that as advice in the form of a question.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's often quite a big change for some people in, oh, wow. But that they can also see what the more open, more curious, more catalytic questions actually enable for their peers or for them when they are in the seat themselves. And so, yeah, they can go on quite a big journey. And it's just, you need different modes and different approaches for different things. So there's not always time for a very deep opening. Right. Sometimes people do need to make quick decisions. But it's also, I think part of it is getting people out of that being your default mode and you have no other mode.
I'm seeing it in my mind as you're talking about it as sort of peeling back the layers that society has placed on us. And so many of those layers come out of the business world, come out of the military, come out of places of power and privilege.
Yep.
And what you're really talking about is peeling a lot of that off to get to what does it mean to be human at the core?
And what do we already know maybe deeply? And what have we already heard from people is important? And what do we feel intuitively? And what is important to us as well? It kind of does come back to often quite deep questions about our values and commitments and how we make those real and how we really enact those in the world. And people are under immense pressure. They're under huge pressure from funders, and often with structures and expectations that are completely misaligned to the kind of long-term and transformative work people might be trying to do. And I find that a lot of the time it's also about peeling back to recognise actually your own power and agency in whatever moment you find yourself in. That even though you may feel and you may be very weighed down by your significant organisational responsibilities and your family and community and other ones, and you might be under this pressure from funders to deliver a certain thing, and you may also be dealing with an absolute trash fire of a political context and actual threats. All of that is absolutely real, and there's kind of often a move you can make that is actually aligned to where you're trying to go and to what is really important to you and your community and your group or your movement. But sometimes you need real space to examine that. And often in going through that space to examine, people do find that power and that move, which might also be the power of refusal.
Talk more about that.
Well, I think we can often get caught up, thinking that we need to participate in government processes or consultations in order to try to shape them. And I definitely think sometimes the power of refusal is very strong. No, I will not legitimate that process with my participation. No, I will not take that funding because it will take us in a direction that really completely undermines what we're trying to do here. So I think that's important. I think sometimes the power is much more about demonstration. I am going to just try and do this in the way that we think would make something different possible and would be aligned with what we think is important. And there's a huge amount, as we know, in complex and adaptive systems that you cannot predict some of the ripples of that, of being and acting differently in a system. And so that can be immensely powerful. And I think you can also relate differently. You can say, I'm not going to jump to a worst possible interpretation of that other organisation in my field for making a move I don't understand. I'm going to come to that with some curiosity. I'm going to also believe that maybe there's room for all of us in doing this work. So I'm not going to orient too much to turf. I'm going to see what's possible and have a different kind of curious conversation. Some of those moves are big, but some of them are small, but can make an enormous difference in what becomes possible.
It's interesting as you're talking. I know that the game show Jeopardy has become a global phenomenon, but it is always remarkable to me how life compares to that, because we come with the answer and then we have to figure out what the question is. It is that power of coming with that curiosity, coming with that openness to say, if we had the answer already, it would have already worked. Part of the thing that I've been noticing is that we have this, psychologists talk about it as error justification, that because we have put so much time into something, it must be right. Therefore, we must do more of it. And the doubling down, the assumption that this thing that hasn't worked because we just haven't done it enough.
Right.
Which is so much of coming with the answer and not coming with that open sense of curiosity that you're talking about, that is that sense of exploring together, which does require that we be vulnerable, that does require that we be open, that we listen differently, and that we make the assumption that maybe I don't have the answer. Maybe that thing that I thought was the answer, maybe it really isn't. And those go so against what we are conditioned. We apply for funding because we have the answer.
Yeah.
Not because we want to explore and find out, but because we have the answer and we're going to convince you that our answer is better than the other person's answer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's so much in the current way that most funding in social purpose work happens that has so many ripple effects down into the practice in such a negative way. And it is interesting because I feel like there are these nuances. I definitely know of cases where there is good evidence and demonstration that something does work, but you cannot convince a funder in the land to support it, and often because, let's face it, evidence doesn't always influence decision-making. It's all of those very deep underlying beliefs, which might be about the fact that this is local to a place and so it's not, quote unquote, scalable in the right way. This might be because they want to support large organisations to do big things, not smaller organisations to do big things with others. Mm-hmm. It might be because of all kinds of unconscious bias, racism and other systemic factors which are influencing those decisions, especially when we look at the composition of foundation boards and other places. So both things are true, that there's a lot of work that is also allowed to fail and continue being funded, including by government. And that is especially allowed to happen. I can speak to, in the Australian example, there are mainstream organisations that have large-scale contracts around things like youth justice, so say supporting particularly young Indigenous people through diversion from the justice system, that fail to show up and do that in a way that really works. And there is significant evidence and all kinds of things that when that is actually community controlled, when that is embedded in culturally connected community structures of care, that can be very, very effective. And when there's a holistic approach to supporting children and young people that really wants them to thrive. But it's kind of okay if those other mainstream programs fail in a sense, because the blame is put on the community. It's not actually put on the organisation in that case. And that is also part of, if I get very nerdy here, something else I've been involved in looking at, which is how our government contracting and budgeting systems don't enable the kinds of community planning, community control at different levels, proper access to real usable information about where money is going and why and how it's being spent, especially around place, in particular places. And so much of that is because government wants, in its word, quote unquote, one throat to choke, where it can have one big contract for services across an enormous geographic area and it only has to deal with one organisation, rather than enabling resources to flow to really locally embedded groups that have a real stake in that place and have the relationships. And not always are not always starting with the full capability to kind of take on those particular services, because they've also been chronically underfunded over many generations. Nobody's trusted them with money beyond small short-term projects, all these things. But that is absolutely where the resources need to actually go.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is I've been involved in some conversations between community-controlled organisations and larger mainstream organisations where the mainstream service provider has said, oh, we're willing to consider transition. But when the community organisation has then looked at what the contract actually involves, so, well, no, we don't actually want that contract. We don't want to deliver it in that way. The whole idea would be we get to actually work with our community to work out how to do this.
Right.
But there are many examples actually internationally that you can see where communities are planning those things and enabling resources to flow.
Can you share an example of one of those, May?
There are great examples of participatory budgeting and planning. Even this is quite a large scale in the sense of a larger city. Madrid developed this platform called Decide, but in Spanish, obviously, where people get to determine priorities, and there's a kind of segment of the city budget that gets to actually directly have input into its allocation. There are other processes that are also much more deliberative, which I think are really interesting. Not perfect, but very promising. Again, creating spaces. So, for example, on a kind of, again, more of a city scale, in Poland, I know they did some amazing community deliberative work after some flooding they had there. And the way this often works as a kind of citizen jury or a deliberative process is that they were able to get a representative-ish sample of people. There are quite rigorous processes that are often used for that, using the electoral roll and other things. Obviously, that also has challenges in terms of who's excluded from those categories. And obviously, you can be more inclusive than that. But then what I think is really promising to learn from is that in those deliberative spaces, people are able to determine who and what they want to learn from. And so then they bring in a lot of different kinds of people who have direct lived experience, who have expertise, who have practitioner experience. And the group is deliberating and sharing different views. And this is kind of a process over time where then a group who have a lot of diversity built in are kind of grappling with actually a whole bunch of different perspective and information. And they were able to come to agreement on a series of measures that the city then took to kind of improve its resilience to flooding in the future. And what you often find is that those groups with that kind of process can actually come to agreement. So there's some real hope in that for what's possible. And I mean, those processes are being used here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I'm based, around also things like planning around climate change, planning around water resources in different places. And there's a whole kind of network internationally, including through the Open Government Partnership, but also the People-Powered network of groups that are using these deliberative and participatory processes to try to imbue these big community decisions that need to be made with some real depth of proper engagement and consideration.
Okay, so I will confess you've got my head exploding with a couple of different things, which you always do, and I appreciate that. The whole concept of making decisions more participatory. In the olden days, before, let's even say before telephone, before electricity, before, let's go 1,000 years ago, decisions in a village were made by the people in the village. As we have gotten more technology, all of those decisions have been concentrated more and more and more and more. And we're the experts. We have representative government now. So we elect somebody to make a decision on my behalf. And if I don't like it, I can talk to them and they can decide whether they want to listen to me or not. What is interesting in the way that you're sharing these more participatory approaches, participatory budgeting, participatory decision making, is that once again, the people have the information. So in a time where you had radio, you had TV, and that was it, and you learned what we have got so many channels to learn. I can type anything into any search engine and something is going to tell me all of the things that I need to know. As a citizen, I can now participate with all kinds of information. It's almost bringing us back to the fact that as the village, we can make decisions about the village.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's so much information, but there's also so much mis and disinformation, and there's so much, all of our information ecosystems are distinct from each other and influenced obviously by the algorithm and our own online behavior and relationships. So obviously we've moved from that kind of broadcast common base of news, which also had its own limits, biases, etc. And what I think is really useful about thinking about these other practices is that they can deepen the democracy that we have, which has become overly determined on that representative nature and on elections as the one aspect that matters. But actually democracy is about participation and involvement and inclusion and equity and justice, we would hope. Again, it's like we were talking about earlier on that smaller scale of the action learning set. You're peeling back these assumptions and ideas that we've taken on kind of in the water that we're swimming in about how we have to be or how our organisations have to be, similarly to what we think democracy has to be. And for representatives who are in that process, some of them kind of balk at this idea that you could have a deliberative process like this, because in its pure form, it does involve a delegation of some authority. So in that Polish example, for example, they said, if the group gets to this level of agreement on a recommendation, we consider that adopted and we will implement it. So it wasn't that you're advising us and then we're deciding. We are actually saying we believe a diverse group of people who live here, listening to and engaging with the diverse range of perspective, experience, evidence, expertise that exists, are going to actually come to a better conclusion than we could come to. And I think this is borne out, I think about James Suretsky's book, The Wisdom of Crowds, that idea that actually a diverse and independent set of views often does come closer to a stronger decision or agreement than a single expert, a group of experts.
Right.
So I think the good thing is the possibility is there. There's a lot of those bits of possibility in the present of these practices, and they exist in parts of the US as well as other places. And so it is kind of up to us to be working out how to make that possibility for much greater and more real and more inclusive participation real where we are. And certainly here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, one way that we think about that as well is we have to think about Te Tirutira Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, as the foundational document of this country that recognises that sovereignty was never ceded. And so that's another layer that has to be present in how we think about what form that might take and the role of Māori iwi in governance and co-governance in this place. So I think there's so much possibility here to learn from.
I'm thinking about the very, very first question in catalytic thinking under the umbrella that we talk about as radical inclusion. And that very first question is, who will be affected by whatever we are considering, and what will it take for them to make the decision? And it's really what you're talking about in that Polish example. I'm thinking about a food bank that we did a demonstration project with. And the food bank was doing a community impact plan. And they spent 2 years talking to folks in their community that are affected by the food bank. They went to their partner agencies and said, bring together the people who you serve and let's have these conversations. They were very possibility driven by your first thought. Of course, they were using catalytic thinking, so it was very possibility driven. When it was all said and done, they had their community members prioritize which of those ideas they thought were the most important. So it continued in that decision-making process because the food bank saw their job as implementing what the community decided.
Yeah.
And that's a very, very different approach that even an organization can do. It doesn't have to be a municipality. It doesn't have to be a country. That an organization, we're so used to, we have the answers, which goes, again, counter to your point in terms of coming with curiosity and coming with the question. And instead looking to say the people who are the most affected really need to be the ones who make the decision. Our job will be to make that happen. And that's where our expertise can come in. We have expertise in making stuff happen. It's such a different way of seeing things, May.
Absolutely. And we love to, when I say we, I'm talking about PRISM, which is the group that I run with my co-founder, Joe Taylor, and we love to talk about experience, expertise, and evidence. It's when you can bring them all together and throughout the process. So yes, determining the priorities, yes, determining what we do, but also in the doing and also in the process of working out who kind of did this work and for whom as well, and what did this generate as well. So it's really how do we think about that across the spectrum of our work.
If you had something that you would want to leave with our listeners, something practical that they can do to start on their journey, what would you suggest?
So I guess it's the thread of the conversation, isn't it? That I would say two things that go together. So how can you always be creating that space to be human, but also to be curious? So even those little micro spaces before you react, even those little spaces in a meeting, it can be very small, but just enough space to consider what are you actually seeing or feeling? What is that actually telling you? Because I think the more people are able to create that little bit of distance from the thing, you're able to actually get a better sense of what is happening and where change and movement might be possible. Often I think we're so emotionally tied up in the change, which makes sense. We're passionate about it. We're committed. But in a way, we're pushing so hard that we're almost swatting away what is really important information about how people are showing up and what that's telling us, even from their behaviour, not the words that they're saying about what's important to them. So I think that ability to take it all in as information is really, really crucial. And then, of course, that muscle of asking open and curious and, of course, catalytic questions. And it's a kind of life-changing skill. It's a life-changing practice. You can do it in your organisation. You can do it in your family. But it makes me think again of Adrienne Maree Brown's work on fractals. You know, how are we going to do this in the big scale if we can't do it in the little scale? So these are small things that we can all test and try for ourselves and see see what it enables.
Thank you so much for being with us today, May. This has just been delightful. I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours.
I mean, me too. It's always a pleasure, Hildy, and I'm so grateful to have been learning from you and with you for such a long time. Catalytic thinking has become such a beautiful and critical part of my life and my practice, and so I'm immensely grateful.
As am I. I'm so grateful to May for sharing her observations and experience with us. I'm especially struck by how seemingly simple May's words of wisdom are. The simple suggestion that we create space and time to be human with each other. How is it that sounds so radical? And yet so many of our societal norms are not about the basics that May talks about. Coming together with a sense of possibility, having curiosity and questions rather than being the expert. Creating rituals and practices to support our having open conversation about what is possible, to keep us coming back to what matters. The examples that May shared resonate with what we know at Creating the Future. When we bring people together to create what is possible together, it feels like magic. And yet it is simply what happens when we allow space for being the very best of what it means to be human. You can learn more about May's work at the podcast page for this episode. And of course, if this episode got you thinking, we hope you'll share this podcast with your friends and colleagues and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, you can learn more about Creating the Future's work at creatingthefuture.org. Thank you for being with us today and for wanting to create a better future for our world. We'll see you next time here at Creating the Future.